The autumn morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Riverside Historical Museum, casting elongated shadows across rows of archived photographs that lined the West Wing corridor. Margaret Hollis had worked as the museum's chief curator for nearly 12 years, and her daily routine had become as predictable as the changing seasons outside those very windows. She arrived each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a leather-bound notebook filled with meticulous observations about the collection. Her colleagues often remarked that Margaret possessed an uncanny ability to spot details others missed, a talent that had proven invaluable when authenticating donated items or piecing together fragments of local history. The museum itself stood as a testament to the town's commitment to preserving its past, housed in a converted railway station that had once served as the primary gateway for settlers moving westward during the late 19th century. Margaret's current project involved cataloguing a recent estate donation from the Whitmore family, one of the founding families whose influence had shaped the region's development for over a century. The collection contained hundreds of items spanning 3 generations, including personal correspondence, business ledgers, decorative arts, and an extensive photographic archive documenting family gatherings, properties, and daily life from the 1880s through the 1950s. Among these materials, cabinet cards and tin types predominated, their sepia tones and formal compositions reflecting the photographic conventions of that era. Margaret had spent the past 3 weeks carefully examining each piece, recording provenance details, noting condition issues, and creating detailed catalogue entries that would eventually become part of the museum's permanent digital database. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities Margaret had cultivated throughout her career as both historian and custodian of community memory. On this particular morning, Margaret settled into her usual workstation in the climate-controlled archive room, surrounded by archival boxes labeled with the Whitmore name. She had developed a systematic approach to processing large donations, beginning with the most fragile items and progressing toward more stable materials. Today's focus was a collection of portrait photographs dating from 1900 to 1910, a period that fascinated Margaret because it represented a transitional moment in American photography when technological advances made studio portraits more accessible to middle-class families. Each photograph told a story, not just through its subject, but through choices about setting, clothing, and composition that revealed social aspirations and cultural values. Margaret handled each image with cotton gloves, examining surfaces for damage, while simultaneously absorbing visual information about the subjects captured in those frozen moments. The photograph that would change everything appeared unremarkable at first glance, nestled between images of stern-faced patriarchs and elaborately dressed matrons. It measured approximately 6 inches by 8 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that bore the embossed name of a photography studio no longer in operation. The image depicted a young girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, seated in an ornate wooden chair against a painted backdrop, suggesting a garden setting. She wore a white dress with intricate lace detailing at the collar and cuffs, her dark hair arranged in careful ringlets that framed a solemn, unsmiling face. The child's hands rested primly in her lap, and her gaze directed straight toward the camera lens held an intensity that seemed unusual for such a young subject. Beside her, positioned on a small upholstered stool, sat a porcelain doll of considerable size, its painted features and elaborate costume suggesting it had been a treasured possession. Margaret made her initial catalogue entry, noting the date inscribed on the photograph's reverse side, 1902, along with a handwritten notation identifying the subject as Abigail Whitmore, daughter of Edmund and Catherine Whitmore. She recorded the photographer's studio name, the image dimensions, and the photograph's overall good condition despite its age. The portrait seemed to represent a typical example of early 20th century child photography, when parents often included favorite toys or pets in formal portraits to help young subjects remain still during long exposure times. Margaret placed the photograph in a protective sleeve and moved it to the completed pile, ready to continue with the remaining items in the box. Yet something about that image lingered in her mind as she processed the next several photographs, a subtle disquiet she could not immediately identify or explain, as if some detail had registered subconsciously without reaching her conscious awareness. 3 days passed before Margaret returned to the Whitmore photograph collection, her attention temporarily diverted by preparations for an upcoming exhibition on textile manufacturing in the region. When she resumed her cataloging work, she decided to create high-resolution digital scans of the most significant portraits, a standard preservation practice that would allow researchers to examine details without handling original materials. The museum had invested in professional scanning equipment 2 years earlier, and Margaret had become proficient at capturing images that revealed nuances invisible to casual observation. She arranged the photographs on the scanning bed chronologically, beginning with the earliest examples and progressing through the decade. The process was meditative, requiring careful positioning and adjustment of settings to ensure optimal capture of tonal ranges and surface textures. When Margaret scanned the 1902 portrait of Abigail Whitmore, she followed her standard protocol of capturing the image at 1200 dots per inch, a resolution that would preserve fine details for future study and reproduction. The scanning process took approximately 40 seconds, during which the bright LED light passed slowly beneath the photograph's surface. Margaret saved the file with its catalog number and corresponding metadata, then moved on to the next image without reviewing the digital capture. It was only later that afternoon, while organizing the day's scans into properly labeled folders on the museum's server, that she opened the Abigail Whitmore file to verify image quality and completeness. The photograph appeared on her monitor at full resolution, and Margaret used her mouse to zoom into various sections, checking for dust, scratches, or other imperfections that might require notation in the condition report. She examined the painted backdrop first, noting the artist's technique in rendering foliage and architectural elements that suggested a prosperous garden environment. The detail visible at high magnification revealed brushstrokes and paint texture that added authenticity to the artificial setting. Margaret then focused on Abigail herself, observing how the photographer had positioned lighting to emphasize the child's features, while creating subtle shadows that added dimension to the composition. The elaborate dress showed remarkable detail under magnification, each stitch of lacework visible as testament to skilled needlework that would have required hours of painstaking labor. Abigail's expression remained enigmatic, even under close scrutiny, her eyes holding that same intense, almost challenging gaze that Margaret had noticed during her initial examination of the physical photograph. Finally, Margaret directed her attention to the doll positioned beside the child, intending to note its style and construction as part of the complete catalog description. As she enlarged that section of the image, progressively increasing magnification until the doll's face filled her entire monitor screen, she felt an immediate visceral reaction that caused her to push back from her desk with such force that her chair rolled several feet across the floor. The doll's painted features, which had appeared conventionally pretty in the original photograph, revealed something profoundly disturbing when examined at extreme magnification. The eyes, rendered in glossy black paint with meticulous attention to highlights and reflections, seemed to look not at the camera but slightly to the side, as if focusing on something beyond the frame. More unsettling was the expression, which close examination revealed was not the serene smile typical of porcelain dolls from that era, but something closer to a grimace, or even a sneer. The painted lips curved in a way that suggested mockery or malice. Margaret sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the magnified image on her screen, while her rational mind struggled to process what her eyes perceived. She had examined thousands of historical photographs during her career and had developed a healthy skepticism about reading too much meaning into artifacts from different cultural contexts. Victorian and Edwardian aesthetics often struck modern viewers as strange or unsettling simply because conventions had changed so dramatically. Yet there was something undeniably wrong about this doll, something that transcended mere stylistic differences or the uncanny valley effect that antique dolls sometimes produced. Margaret zoomed out slightly, then zoomed back in, wondering if the expression might be an artifact of lighting or shadow. But each examination confirmed her initial impression. She grabbed her notebook and wrote in precise capital letters, "Doll expression anomalous. Requires further investigation," underlining the words 3 times. Margaret spent the remainder of that day attempting to research the doll's origins and manufacturer, searching through reference books on antique toys and decorative arts from the early 20th century. The museum's library contained several volumes on doll collecting and history, and she pulled every relevant title from the shelves, spreading them across a reading table, while methodically examining photographs and descriptions of porcelain dolls produced between 1890 and 1910. Most dolls from that period came from German or French manufacturers who specialized in creating lifelike representations with delicate features, glass eyes, and elaborate costumes. The standard aesthetic emphasized innocence and beauty, with manufacturers competing to produce increasingly realistic and appealing faces that would attract buyers. None of the examples Margaret found in her references displayed anything resembling the disturbing expression she had observed in the Whitmore photograph. She expanded her research to include local newspaper archives, hoping to find advertisements or articles mentioning toy shops or doll imports in the region during the relevant time period. The museum maintained microfilm copies of the town's 2 historical newspapers, and Margaret spent hours scrolling through editions from 1900 to 1905, her eyes straining to read the small print of classified advertisements and social notices. She discovered several references to merchants selling imported dolls for Christmas, along with prices that indicated such items were luxury goods, affordable only to families of substantial means like the Whitmores. One advertisement from December 1901 particularly caught her attention, describing newly arrived French bisque dolls with genuine human hair and eyes that appear to follow you across the room. But the hyperbolic marketing language offered no clue about the specific doll in Abigail's portrait. Margaret's investigation took a new direction when she decided to examine other photographs in the Whitmore collection, searching for additional images of Abigail or the doll that might provide context or alternative perspectives. She returned to the archive room and methodically reviewed every photograph from the 1900 to 1910 period, looking specifically for the distinctive doll with its unsettling features. She found 3 more portraits of Abigail taken at different ages, documenting her growth from approximately age 5 through early adolescence. In the earliest image, dated 1900, Abigail appeared alone, wearing a dark dress and holding a small stuffed rabbit. The 1904 portrait showed her at about 10 years old, standing beside a piano in what appeared to be the Whitmore family parlor, with no toys or dolls visible. The final image from 1907 depicted a teenage Abigail in a garden setting, her face thinner and more angular, her expression conveying the self-consciousness typical of adolescence. The doll appeared in none of these other photographs, making its presence in the 1902 portrait more puzzling and significant. If the doll had been a cherished possession, one would expect it to feature in multiple family photographs, especially given the expense and effort involved in arranging formal portrait sessions. Margaret wondered whether the doll might have been a studio prop rather than a personal belonging, but this seemed unlikely given the photographic conventions of the era, when parents typically brought treasured items from home to help children feel comfortable during long exposure times. She made careful notes about the doll's absence from other images and added this observation to her growing list of questions. The mystery was beginning to consume her attention in ways that surprised her, pulling her away from routine cataloging work and towards something resembling an actual investigation. Margaret decided to examine the physical photograph once more under magnification, using a jeweler's loupe that would allow detailed inspection without the potential distortions of digital imaging. She retrieved the photograph from its protective sleeve and carried it to a workstation equipped with specialized lighting designed for close examination of artifacts. Under the bright focused illumination, with the loupe pressed close to the photograph's surface, she studied the doll with methodical precision, examining every millimeter of its painted features. The extreme close-up view confirmed what the digital scan had revealed, but it also showed something she had not previously noticed. Behind the doll, barely visible in the shadows of the painted backdrop, there appeared to be another figure, indistinct and partially obscured, as if someone had been standing just outside the primary composition when the photograph was taken. The figure was so faint that Margaret could not determine whether it represented an actual person or simply an artifact of the backdrop painting. but its presence added another layer of strangeness to an already unsettling image. The discovery of the shadow figure compelled Margaret to seek expert consultation, something she rarely did without exhausting her own research capabilities first. She contacted Professor David Chen at the State University, a colleague who specialized in photographic history and forensic image analysis. Margaret had collaborated with Professor Chen on several authentication projects over the years and trusted his analytical rigor and discretion. She explained her findings carefully, emphasizing the unusual features she had observed and sending him high-resolution scans of the Abigail Whitmore portrait, along with the other family photographs for comparison. Professor Chen responded within 24 hours, his email message conveying both professional interest and personal intrigue at the anomalies Margaret had identified. He proposed visiting the museum the following week to examine the original photograph and conduct detailed analysis using portable equipment he had recently acquired for field research. While awaiting Professor Chen's visit, Margaret decided to investigate the Whitmore family history more thoroughly. Hoping that biographical information might shed light on the photograph's context and significance, she began with the museum's own archives, reviewing documents from the recent estate donation for references to Abigail or her immediate family members. The collection included several bound volumes of correspondence, business records, and personal papers spanning multiple generations. Margaret focused her attention on materials from the 1900 to 1910 period, searching for letters, diary entries, or financial records that might mention the doll or provide insight into Abigail's childhood. She found numerous documents relating to Edmund Whitmore's timber business, including ledgers recording substantial profits from logging operations and land speculation, but personal materials were disappointingly sparse. The breakthrough came when Margaret discovered a slim leather journal tucked inside a larger account book, apparently overlooked during previous archival processing. The journal belonged to Catherine Whitmore, Abigail's mother, and contained sporadic entries dated between 1901 and 1903. Catherine's writing style was formal and restrained, typical of educated women of her class and era, but certain entries revealed genuine emotional distress beneath the proper surface. An entry from March 1902, just months before the portrait was taken, described Abigail's increasingly difficult behavior following an illness the previous winter. Catherine wrote that the child had become withdrawn and uncommunicative, spending hours alone in her room speaking to herself or to her dolls in voices that Catherine found disturbing. The entry concluded with a sentence that made Margaret's skin prickle with recognition and unease. The new doll that arrived from her grandmother seems to have made matters worse rather than better. As Abigail insists, it tells her things no child should hear or know. Margaret photographed the journal pages with her phone, hands trembling slightly as she captured Catherine's elegant script. She continued reading, finding additional references to Abigail's troubling behavior throughout the spring and summer of 1902. Catherine mentioned consulting the family physician, who attributed the child's problems to overwrought nerves and prescribed rest, fresh air, and restricted stimulation. Another entry from July described an incident in which Abigail was found in the garden at dawn, still wearing her nightdress, having apparently sleepwalked or deliberately left the house during the night. Most disturbing was an August entry, written just weeks after the portrait session, in which Catherine expressed relief that the doll had been removed from the house, following an unspecified incident that left Abigail with nightmares and the household staff reluctant to enter the child's room after dark. Catherine provided no details about what had actually occurred, writing only that certain matters were too delicate and disturbing to commit to paper even in a private journal. Professor Chen arrived at the museum on a grey Tuesday morning, carrying 2 aluminum cases containing specialized photographic equipment. Margaret had prepared the archive room for his visit, clearing a large workspace and ensuring privacy by informing her colleagues that she and the professor would be conducting sensitive authentication work that required absolute concentration and controlled conditions. Professor Chen unpacked his equipment methodically, setting up a digital microscope connected to a laptop computer, along with various light sources and measuring instruments. He began his examination by studying the physical photograph under different lighting conditions documenting his observations with both written notes and video recording. His face remained professionally neutral throughout the initial inspection, but Margaret noticed him repeatedly returning to the doll's face, his expression becoming progressively more troubled. After nearly 3 hours of detailed analysis, Professor Chen leaned back from his workstation and removed his examination gloves with slow deliberation. He looked at Margaret with an expression that combined scientific puzzlement with something closer to genuine disquiet, an unusual combination from a man known for his rational skepticism and empirical rigor. He explained that the photograph showed no evidence of manipulation or alteration, confirming that it was an authentic period image produced using techniques and materials consistent with early 20th century studio photography. However, his analysis had revealed several features that he found deeply anomalous and difficult to explain through conventional understanding of photographic processes or doll manufacturing from that era. The doll's expression appeared to have been deliberately crafted to create psychological discomfort, employing subtle asymmetries and proportions that violated standard aesthetic conventions. More troubling was his analysis of the shadow figure Margaret had noticed, which his equipment revealed to be not part of the painted backdrop, but rather an actual photographic exposure of something or someone present during the portrait session, standing just outside the primary frame and captured only partially by the camera lens. Professor Chen's findings transformed Margaret's curiosity into something approaching obsession, driving her to pursue leads with an intensity that surprised even herself. She requested permission from the museum director to dedicate significant time to researching the Whitmore photograph, framing her request in terms of potential exhibition value and scholarly publication opportunities. The director, a pragmatic administrator more concerned with attendance numbers than historical mysteries, granted provisional approval provided Margaret continued meeting her regular cataloging responsibilities. Over the following weeks, Margaret developed a systematic investigation plan that combined archival research, genealogical tracking, and outreach to collectors and experts in antique dolls. She created a detailed timeline of Abigail Whitmore's life using census records, school enrollment documents, and society page mentions to track the child's development from birth through adulthood. The genealogical research yielded both illuminating and troubling information. Abigail Whitmore had lived a relatively short life, dying in 1924 at the age of 29, from what death records described as complications from influenza, though Margaret suspected the vague terminology might conceal other causes. Abigail had never married and appeared to have lived as a semi-recluse in the family home following her parents' deaths in 1918. Newspaper archives contained few mentions of her during her adult years, a striking absence for a woman from such a prominent family who would have been expected to participate actively in social and philanthropic activities. Margaret discovered one brief article from 1920 describing an incident in which police were summoned to the Whitmore residence following complaints from neighbors about disturbing sounds. But the matter was apparently resolved without charges, and no further details were reported. The lack of information about Abigail's adult life suggested either deliberate privacy or possible mental health issues that the family had worked to conceal from public knowledge. Margaret's investigation into the doll itself led her down increasingly strange pathways. She contacted auction houses, doll museums, and private collectors throughout the country, describing the doll's appearance and asking whether anyone had encountered similar examples. Most responses were polite but unhelpful, with experts confirming that the doll's features as Margaret described them did not match any known manufacturer's products from the period. However, one collector in Massachusetts responded with unexpected information that opened an entirely new dimension to the mystery. The collector, an elderly woman named Judith Hartwell, who had spent 40 years studying Victorian and Edwardian dolls, wrote that Margaret's description reminded her of rumors she had heard decades earlier about a small workshop in Eastern Europe that produced custom dolls for wealthy clients with particular requirements or interests in occult practices. According to Judith's correspondence, these dolls were never sold through normal commercial channels, but were commissioned privately and produced in very limited numbers. The workshop allegedly specialized in creating dolls with specific expressions or features, requested by clients who believed such objects could serve as vessels or focal points for spiritual energies. Judith emphasized that these stories existed primarily as collector folklore, unsupported by solid documentary evidence, but she had encountered enough fragmentary references over the years to believe some truth underlay the rumors. She mentioned one particularly disturbing account from a collector in England who claimed to have briefly owned such a doll in the 1970s, describing it as having an expression that seemed to change depending on viewing angle and lighting, creating profound psychological discomfort. The collector had ultimately destroyed the doll after experiencing recurring nightmares and disturbances in her home that ceased immediately following the doll's destruction. Margaret shared this information with Professor Chen, who received it with characteristic scientific skepticism, but acknowledged that folklore often contained kernels of historical reality, obscured by embellishment and misunderstanding. He suggested that regardless of the doll's actual origins or any supernatural associations, the object clearly possessed qualities deliberately designed to create psychological impact, whether through artistic skill or understanding of visual perception principles that produced uncanny effects. Professor Chen proposed co-authoring an academic paper examining the photograph from multiple perspectives, including art history, psychology, and cultural studies. Margaret agreed enthusiastically, recognizing that formal publication would provide structure for their research, while potentially reaching audiences who might contribute additional information. As they began outlining their paper, Margaret could not shake the feeling that their investigation had only scratched the surface of something far more complex and disturbing than an unusual antique photograph. The shadow figure continued to haunt her thoughts, its partial presence suggesting witness to events and contexts that remained frustratingly obscured by time and deliberate obscurity. The turning point in Margaret's investigation came from an unexpected source, demonstrating how historical research often depends on serendipity as much as systematic methodology. A retired librarian named Agnes Morrison contacted the museum after reading a brief article Margaret had placed in a regional history newsletter describing her research into the Whitmore family and unusual Victorian photographs. Agnes explained that her grandmother had worked as a housemaid for the Whitmore family during the early 1900s, and family stories about that employment had been passed down through generations. Agnes possessed several items inherited from her grandmother, including a small collection of letters and a detailed diary covering the years 1901 to 1905. Agnes had never examined these materials closely, having received them only recently following her mother's death, but Margaret's article had prompted her to review the documents and discover numerous references to young Abigail Whitmore and disturbing events in the household. Margaret met Agnes at a coffee shop near the museum, her anticipation barely contained as the older woman carefully removed a cardboard box from her shopping bag. The box contained 3 leather-bound notebooks and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, all in remarkably good condition considering their age. Agnes explained that her grandmother, whose name was Clara Bennett, had been literate and observant, qualities that made her diary entries particularly valuable, as primary source material about daily life in prosperous households of that era. Margaret spent the next several hours at Agnes's dining room table, carefully reading through Clara's precise handwriting while Agnes prepared tea and shared family stories about her grandmother's character and later life. The diary entries were revelation and confirmation, providing detailed eyewitness accounts of the events Catherine Whitmore had alluded to so obliquely in her own journal. Clara's diary revealed that the doll had arrived at the Whitmore household in February 1902, sent as a gift from Edmund's mother, who lived in New York and had connections to European aristocracy through her own family lineage. The doll was expensive and elaborate, created by craftsmen whose names Clara did not record, but described as foreign and difficult to pronounce. From the moment the doll entered the house, Clara noted that it created unease among the staff, several of whom refused to enter Abigail's room when the doll was visible. Clara wrote about finding the doll in different positions and locations, despite Abigail insisting she had not moved it, and about hearing the child conducting elaborate conversations with the doll in voices that seemed to include responses as if 2 people were speaking. Most disturbing were Clara's accounts of Abigail's personality changes during the months following the doll's arrival, describing the previously cheerful child becoming secretive, manipulative, and occasionally cruel to animals and younger children who visited the household. The diary entry from August 12, 1902, provided explicit details about the incident that led to the doll's removal, details Catherine Whitmore had deemed too disturbing to record. According to Clara, she had entered Abigail's room early one morning to open curtains and prepare the child for the day, only to find Abigail sitting upright in bed, staring at the doll positioned in a chair across the room. The child appeared to be in a trance state, completely unresponsive to Clara's voice or touch. When Clara approached to shake Abigail's shoulder more firmly, she reported that the doll's head suddenly rotated to face her, despite no one touching it, and that she heard what she described as a child's voice, speaking words in a language she did not understand. Clara had screamed and fled the room, and when other staff members arrived minutes later, they found Abigail unconscious on the floor, with the doll lying beside her. Its porcelain face cracked down the middle as if struck with considerable force. Abigail remained unconscious for nearly 6 hours, and when she finally awakened, she claimed to remember nothing about the incident. Margaret photographed every page of Clara's diary with meticulous care, ensuring she captured the housemaid's account in complete detail. Agnes agreed to donate the materials to the museum's collection, recognizing their historical significance and expressing relief to have them preserved in a professional archive rather than remaining in her attic. With Clara's testimony now available, Margaret possessed documentation that transformed the Whitmore photograph from a curious anomaly into evidence of something far more substantial and disturbing. She shared the diary entries with Professor Chen, whose initial skepticism about supernatural explanations began to waver in the face of such detailed, contemporaneous accounts from multiple independent sources. Together they recognized that their investigation had reached a critical juncture, requiring them to decide how publicly to present their findings and how to frame conclusions that challenged conventional boundaries between historical research and phenomena that defied rational explanation. The photograph that had seemed merely unsettling now appeared as testimony to events that suggested the doll had been something more than an inanimate object, though exactly what remained a question neither Margaret nor Professor Chen felt fully equipped to answer. The decision to mount a public exhibition based on their research came after lengthy deliberation and consultation with the museum's board of directors. Margaret and Professor Chen prepared a detailed proposal outlining their findings and suggesting an exhibition titled Unseen Stories, hidden narratives in historical photographs that would use the Whitmore portrait as centerpiece while contextualizing it within broader discussions about Victorian spiritualism, childhood psychology, and the ways material objects carried emotional and psychological significance. The proposal carefully avoided sensationalistic language while honestly presenting the documented facts surrounding the photograph and the doll. Several board members expressed reservations about featuring content that might be perceived as promoting supernatural beliefs or exploiting tragic family history for entertainment purposes, but ultimately, the educational value and scholarly rigor of the research convinced the board to approve the exhibition with certain conditions, including prominent contextual information and expert commentary. Margaret spent 3 months developing the exhibition, working with a professional designer to create displays that would present their findings in ways that respected both historical evidence and audience intelligence. The centerpiece was an enlarged version of the 1902 portrait, displayed under carefully controlled lighting that allowed viewers to examine details while preserving the original photograph. Surrounding displays included Catherine Whitmore's journal entries, relevant pages from Clara Bennett's diary, historical context about doll manufacturing and Victorian childhood, and Professor Chen's technical analysis of the photograph's unusual features. Margaret wrote extensive wall text that guided visitors through the investigation's progression, presenting evidence chronologically and allowing audiences to draw their own conclusions about the nature and significance of what the photograph captured. She included information about psychological phenomena like pareidolia and the uncanny valley effect, providing scientific frameworks for understanding why certain images created feelings of unease, without necessarily invoking supernatural explanations. The exhibition opened on a rainy October evening, attracting unexpected crowds that surprised both Margaret and museum administrators. Local media had covered the story extensively, framing it as a mystery that blended historical research with elements of ghost stories and psychological thriller. Margaret gave several interviews emphasizing the exhibition's scholarly foundations, while acknowledging the genuinely strange aspects of their findings that resisted easy explanation. She was particularly careful to present Abigail Whitmore not as a horror story protagonist, but as a real child who had experienced genuine distress, possibly exacerbated by the expectations and limitations of early 20th century understanding about mental health and child development. The exhibition attracted diverse audiences, including historians, psychologists, paranormal enthusiasts, and general visitors drawn by the mysterious narrative, creating unexpected opportunities for interdisciplinary discussion about how different fields approached questions about perception, belief, and historical interpretation. Among the visitors during the exhibition's first week was an elderly man named Thomas Hartley, who approached Margaret with information that added a final, unsettling dimension to the investigation. Thomas explained that his grandfather had worked as a caretaker for various properties owned by the Whitmore family, including the main residence where Abigail had lived. According to family stories Thomas had heard throughout his life, his grandfather had been present when the doll was finally removed from the house in 1902, taken not to be stored or donated, but deliberately destroyed. The method of destruction was significant. The doll had been burned in the property's incinerator, but according to Thomas's grandfather, the porcelain refused to break down completely despite intense heat, and the remaining fragments had been buried in an unmarked location on the property grounds. Thomas also shared a detail his grandfather had mentioned repeatedly over the years, describing how during the burning process, those present heard sounds that seemed to come from the doll itself, sounds that resembled a child crying and then laughing in alternating patterns until the fire consumed everything. Margaret listened to Thomas's account with a mixture of fascination and profound disquiet, recognizing that this information, while impossible to verify through conventional historical methods, aligned disturbingly well with everything else they had discovered. She added Thomas's testimony to the exhibition materials with appropriate contextualization about oral history's value and limitations. The encounter reinforced Margaret's growing conviction that the photograph captured something genuinely anomalous, an intersection of material culture, psychological distress, and possibly influences that exceeded current scientific understanding. As the exhibition continued to attract visitors and generate discussion, Margaret found herself reflecting on the nature of historical evidence and the ways certain objects seem to carry traces of the events and emotions surrounding their creation and use. The photograph of Abigail and the doll had become a window into a past that resisted simple narratives, challenging both skepticism and credulity, while refusing to resolve into comfortable explanations that would allow observers to dismiss the mystery or explain it entirely through rational frameworks. The exhibition's success led to unexpected consequences that extended far beyond Margaret's initial intentions. News coverage attracted attention from researchers and institutions across the country, resulting in invitations to present their findings at academic conferences and opportunities to examine similar cases in other collections. Most significantly, Margaret began receiving correspondence from individuals who claimed to own or have encountered dolls with similar disturbing characteristics, each letter describing objects that produced inexplicable psychological effects or were associated with troubling events. Professor Chen suggested they catalog these reports systematically, creating a database that might reveal patterns or commonalities suggesting either manufacturing sources or psychological mechanisms that explained the phenomena. Margaret agreed, but insisted they approach such reports with rigorous skepticism, distinguishing between documented historical cases and potentially unreliable contemporary accounts influenced by suggestion or desire for attention. One particularly credible report came from a curator at a museum in Philadelphia who had encountered a doll matching Margaret's description among items recovered from an estate sale 3 years earlier. The doll had been briefly displayed in an exhibition on Victorian toys before being removed after multiple visitors complained of feeling dizzy, anxious, or experiencing headaches while viewing it. The curator had stored the doll in a secured archive area where it remained, and after reading about Margaret's research, she offered to send detailed photographs and arrange for Margaret to examine the object in person. Margaret accepted immediately, recognizing that direct access to a potentially related artifact could provide crucial comparative data. She traveled to Philadelphia accompanied by Professor Chen, both of them approaching the examination with scientific rigor while acknowledging their own underlying apprehension about what they might discover. The Philadelphia doll proved to be remarkably similar to the one in Abigail's photograph, though not identical. It measured approximately 18 inches tall, made of fine porcelain with elaborate period-appropriate clothing and real human hair. The face bore the same unsettling expression Margaret had observed in the photograph, with eyes that seemed to focus slightly away from the viewer, and a mouth curved in an ambiguous expression between smile and sneer. Professor Chen conducted detailed analysis using the same equipment he had employed on the photograph, discovering that the doll's facial features incorporated subtle asymmetries and proportions that created visual dissonance, triggering low-level stress responses in observers without obvious cause. More intriguing was his discovery that the doll's head contained a small cavity accessed through a panel in the back of the skull, within which lay a tiny fabric bundle wrapped in deteriorated silk and tied with hair. The museum had never examined this internal feature before, and when they carefully removed and unwrapped the bundle, they found fragments of paper bearing handwritten text in a language none of them could identify. Margaret arranged for the paper fragments to be analyzed by linguistic experts at a nearby university, who identified the text as a mixture of Latin and Romanian, containing phrases associated with folk magic practices from the Carpathian region. The text appeared to be a form of binding spell or invocation intended to attach spiritual entities to physical objects, though the translation remained somewhat uncertain given the fragmentary condition and archaic dialect. This discovery provided the first concrete evidence supporting Judith Hartwell's claims about dolls manufactured for occult purposes, suggesting that a small industry had indeed existed, serving clients who believed manufactured objects could be prepared to serve as vessels for non-material entities or influences. Margaret and Professor Chen published their findings in a peer-reviewed journal, carefully presenting the evidence while avoiding definitive claims about supernatural reality, instead focusing on the historical fact that some people had created and used such objects based on specific metaphysical beliefs, and that the object's design deliberately incorporated features intended to produce psychological effects. The publication generated significant controversy within academic circles, with some scholars praising the rigorous documentation, while others criticized what they viewed as lending credibility to superstitious beliefs. Margaret found herself defending not the reality of supernatural phenomena, but rather the importance of taking seriously the beliefs and practices of historical actors, even when those beliefs contradicted modern scientific understanding. She argued that dismissing such evidence out of hand represented its own form of bias, preventing scholars from fully understanding the complexity of past cultures and the genuine effects that beliefs and associated practices could produce, regardless of whether the beliefs themselves were objectively true. The debate enriched the exhibition's impact, attracting philosophers, theologians, and scientists to participate in public discussions that explored fundamental questions about knowledge, evidence, and the boundaries between material and immaterial explanations for human experience. Through all of this, the photograph of Abigail and the doll remained at the center, its unsettling image serving as focal point for discussions that transcended simple horror or curiosity to engage profound questions about how objects, images, and beliefs shaped human psychology and historical events. As the exhibition entered its final months, Margaret made one last discovery that provided closure of sorts while opening new questions about Abigail's ultimate fate. While processing additional Whitmore family materials that had been delayed in estate settlement, she encountered a small wooden box containing personal effects from Abigail's adult years. Among these items was a letter Abigail had written in 1923, apparently never sent, addressed to a cousin who had inquired about childhood memories. The letter was remarkable for its candor and self-awareness, with Abigail describing in careful detail her memories of the doll and the events surrounding it. She wrote that she had only fragmentary recollections of that period, remembering the doll as both fascinating and terrifying, an object that seemed to offer companionship while simultaneously draining something essential from her. Abigail described the aftermath of the doll's destruction as a gradual awakening, as if she had been living in a fog that slowly lifted, though she acknowledged that she never fully recovered her previous personality or capacity for normal social connection. Most significantly, Abigail's letter contained a passage that seemed to explain the shadow figure Margaret and Professor Chen had observed in the photograph. Abigail wrote that during the portrait session, she had been aware of a presence standing behind the photographer, a figure she perceived as female and elderly, though she could not see it clearly when she tried to look directly at it. She described feeling compelled to remain still and focused on the doll despite her fear, as if the doll itself was directing her attention and behavior. Abigail wrote that she had tried to tell her parents about these experiences, but found herself unable to articulate what she perceived, the words seeming to evaporate before she could speak them. The letter concluded with Abigail expressing gratitude that the doll had been destroyed, and hoping that others would never encounter similar objects, though she feared that whatever had been invested in or attached to the doll might not have been fully eliminated through physical destruction. Margaret included Abigail's letter in the exhibition's final section, presenting it as the voice of the person at the center of the mystery, finally given opportunity to speak directly across more than a century. The letter transformed visitor experience of the entire exhibition, providing human context that prevented the story from becoming merely a curiosity or horror tale. Reading Abigail's words, visitors confronted a real person's suffering and the limitations of her era's ability to understand or address psychological distress, whether its sources were entirely internal or involved genuine interaction with external influences. Margaret observed that many visitors were visibly moved by Abigail's testimony, standing silently before the displayed letter, with expressions suggesting deep thought or emotional response. The exhibition had evolved from an investigation into a mysterious photograph, into a meditation on childhood, suffering, belief, and the ways objects carried and transmitted influences across time. The museum's board of directors, initially hesitant about the exhibition, ultimately declared it the institution's most successful program in terms of both attendance and critical reception. Margaret received recognition from professional organizations and invitations to develop similar exhibitions at other institutions, yet she found herself reluctant to pursue another investigation of this intensity, recognizing that the Whitmore case had affected her more profoundly than she initially realized. She had entered the research as a skeptical scholar committed to rational explanation, and while she remained committed to empirical methodology, the accumulated evidence had eroded her certainty about the boundaries between material and immaterial, natural and supernatural. She could not claim to know definitively what the doll had been or what had occurred in the Whitmore household in 1902, but she had documented a case that resisted simple dismissal or explanation. Professor Chen, meanwhile, continued investigating similar cases, developing a research program focused on objects that produced consistent psychological effects through design features or cultural associations. He maintained his scientific skepticism about supernatural claims, while acknowledging that certain artifacts possessed qualities that current understanding could not fully explain. He and Margaret remained collaborators and friends, occasionally consulting on unusual items that appeared in museum collections or private holdings. The photograph of Abigail and the doll remained on permanent display in the museum's collection, properly conserved and contextualized within the broader story they had uncovered. Margaret sometimes visited the exhibit room after hours, standing before the enlarged portrait and wondering what Abigail might think of how her childhood trauma had become a vehicle for serious discussion about history, psychology, and the boundaries of knowledge. She hoped that in some way, Their work had honored Abigail's experience and memory, transforming private suffering into public understanding without exploiting or sensationalizing what the child had endured. 5 years after the exhibition closed, Margaret received an unexpected package containing materials from a private collection in Austria. The sender, a dealer in antique photographs and ephemera, explained that he had acquired documents from an estate that included correspondence from the manufacturer, believed to have created the Whitmore doll and similar objects. The letters, written in German and dated between 1895 and 1910, described a small workshop operated by a family named Konstantin that specialized in creating dolls for clients with particular specifications. The correspondence revealed that the Konstantins had developed techniques for incorporating symbolic materials and ritual preparation into their manufacturing process, creating objects intended to serve as focal points for psychological influence or spiritual attachment. The letters discuss their methods matter-of-factly, treating these practices as craft skills passed through family tradition rather than as occult secrets or supernatural manipulation. Margaret and Professor Chen spent months analyzing the documents with assistance from translators and historians specializing in Central European cultural practices. The letters painted a complex picture of a family operating at the intersection of craftsmanship, folk belief, and commercial enterprise, serving wealthy clients who maintained traditional beliefs despite the era's modernization. The Konstantins appear to have viewed their work as providing genuine service, creating objects that allowed clients to focus intention, memorialize deceased loved ones, or establish psychological connections they believed would benefit children or other family members. The workshop closed around 1912, apparently unable to sustain business as cultural attitudes shifted and demand for such specialized items declined. The final letters suggested the family had scattered, with some members emigrating to America while others remained in Europe. Though specific details remained unclear, this new information provided context for understanding how objects like the Whitmore doll came into existence without requiring belief in supernatural phenomena. Though it did not eliminate the possibility that the manufacturer's beliefs and practices might have produced effects beyond mere psychological suggestion, Margaret published a follow-up article incorporating these findings, arguing that the case illustrated how material culture carried forward beliefs and practices from earlier periods, and how objects created with specific intentions often retained associations that affected subsequent owners, regardless of whether they shared the original maker's beliefs. The article contributed to growing scholarly interest in the intersection of material culture, psychology, and historical consciousness, helping establish a framework for studying objects that possessed what she termed charged characteristics, qualities that consistently produced strong responses across different observers and contexts. Margaret eventually retired from museum work, but maintained her research interests, writing a book that expanded on the Whitmore case while examining similar examples from other collections and time periods. The book reached both academic and general audiences, offering a model for how historians could engage with evidence that challenged conventional disciplinary boundaries without abandoning rigorous methodology. She argued that the most interesting historical cases often involved ambiguity and resistance to simple explanation, and that scholars served their disciplines best by documenting such cases thoroughly while acknowledging the limits of certainty. The photograph of Abigail and the doll featured prominently on the book's cover, its unsettling image continuing to attract attention and provoke discussion decades after Margaret first noticed something strange in what had appeared to be an ordinary portrait. In her final chapter, Margaret reflected on what the investigation had taught her about the nature of historical evidence and the responsibilities of those who interpret the past. She wrote that every photograph, every artifact, every document contained more than its obvious surface content, and that careful attention often revealed unexpected depths and complexities. The Whitmore photograph had appeared unremarkable until close examination revealed its strange qualities. Just as many historical sources contained hidden narratives waiting for observers patient and attentive enough to discover them. Margaret concluded by noting that Abigail Whitmore's experience, whether understood as psychological trauma, supernatural encounter, or some combination of influences that transcended current categories, deserved recognition as genuine and significant. The child's suffering had been real, regardless of its ultimate causes, and the photograph remained testimony to events that changed a life and rippled across generations. In documenting and presenting this testimony, Margaret hoped she had contributed to a more nuanced understanding of how objects, images, and beliefs shaped human experience across time, and how historians might approach evidence that challenged comfortable assumptions about the boundaries between the explainable and the mysterious.